Fog clung to the Millbrook River like cigarette smoke in a dive bar, thick and stubborn, refusing to lift even as the sun climbed higher over the weathered brick buildings that lined Water Street. Michael Torres stood at the loading dock behind Peterson's hardware, stacking 50-pound bags of concrete mix with the methodical rhythm of a man who'd learned to find meditation in manual labor. His work shirt, already damp with sweat despite the cool October air, bore the faded logo of the warehouse where he'd picked up his second shift at dawn. The river ran fast this time of year, swollen from 3 days of steady rain that had turned the usually docile waterway into something hungry and unpredictable. Michael could hear it from where he worked, the sound different from the gentle murmur he'd grown up with, more urgent now, like it was trying to tell him something he wasn't quite ready to understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He was reaching for another bag when the scream cut through the morning quiet like a blade through canvas. High-pitched, desperate, the kind of sound that bypasses the brain and goes straight to the spine. Michael's hands froze on the concrete bag, his head snapping toward the river where a small figure flailed in the churning brown water about 30 yards downstream from the old stone bridge. "Help! Somebody help!" The voice belonged to Mrs. Peterson from the flower shop, her usually pristine silver hair wild as she ran along the riverbank, her arthritic hands pressed against her mouth in horror. "There's a boy in the water!" Michael dropped the bag without thinking, his work boots pounding against the wet asphalt as he sprinted toward the river. Behind him, he could hear other voices joining the chaos. Car doors slamming, someone shouting for the fire department, but all of it seemed muffled and distant compared to the roar of water and the sight of that small head disappearing and reappearing between the waves. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, his dark hair plastered against his skull as he fought against the current that was dragging him toward the sharp rocks near Miller's Point. Michael's mind cataloged the details with the strange clarity that comes in moments of crisis. Blue windbreaker, probably from the elementary school, small hands reaching desperately for anything solid, legs kicking, with the uncoordinated panic of someone who'd never been taught to swim in moving water. "Don't go in there, Torres," Jimmy Peterson hollered from somewhere behind him. "Current's too strong. Wait for the rescue squad." But Michael was already kicking off his steel-toed boots, his calloused fingers working at his belt buckle with hands that had steadied themselves through worse things than this. The boy went under again, longer this time, and when he surfaced he was 20 yards further downstream, his movements weaker, more desperate. Michael had maybe 30 seconds before the kid disappeared for good, maybe less. The water hit him like a fist made of ice and broken glass, driving the air from his lungs and setting every nerve ending on fire. The current grabbed him immediately, trying to spin him sideways, but Michael had grown up on this river back when it was cleaner and safer, back when his mother would let him swim in the deep holes behind the paper mill. His body remembered the rhythm even if his mind was screaming at him to get out, get back to shore, think about Lila who needed him alive. But the boy was right there, maybe 10 feet away, his face white with cold and terror, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he slipped under again. Michael pushed himself harder, his shoulders burning as he fought against the current, his waterlogged clothes weighing him down like lead blankets. The boy surfaced one more time, arms windmilling frantically, and Michael lunged forward with everything he had left. His fingers closed around the sodden windbreaker just as they both went under, the river's roar becoming a muffled thunder in his ears. The boy was deadweight now, unconscious or close to it, and Michael wrapped his arm around the small chest and kicked toward what he hoped was the surface, his lungs burning for air that seemed impossibly far away. They broke through together, Michael gasping and choking as he tried to keep both their heads above water. The shore looked miles away, but he could see people running along the bank, hands outstretched, voices calling encouragement that barely registered over the sound of his own heart hammering against his ribs. "Yeah, then." Willing hands dragged them both onto the muddy bank. Michael's vision was going gray around the edges. He collapsed beside the boy, watching through a haze as Mrs. Peterson pressed her ear to the child's chest, her face tight with concentration. For a terrible moment, everything was silent, except for the river and Michael's ragged breathing. Then the boy coughed, water streaming from his mouth as his eyes fluttered open, blue and confused and beautifully alive. Michael closed his own eyes and let his forehead rest against the cold mud, feeling his mother's voice whisper something soft and proud in Spanish, a prayer of gratitude that tasted like rain and second chances. The knock came at 6:47 a.m., 3 sharp raps that cut through Michael's coffee-scented kitchen like an accusation. He'd been awake since 4:30 anyway, running on the kind of adrenaline hangover that follows a brush with mortality, the taste of river water still lingering at the back of his throat despite the 3 cups of coffee he'd already consumed. Lila sat at their small table, her dark eyes bright with excitement as she worked her way through a bowl of cereal, chattering about how her daddy was a real-life superhero. "That's probably another reporter," she said, bouncing slightly in her chair with 8-year-old enthusiasm. "Mrs. Henderson said they've been calling the school asking about us. She said you're going to be famous." Michael's stomach clenched. He'd managed to avoid the crowd that gathered after the rescue yesterday, slipping away while the paramedics worked on Henry Whitman, the boy whose name he'd learned from the whispered conversations of the bystanders. But privacy was a luxury that apparently came with an expiration date in a town the size of Millbrook. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and Michael opened the door to find a young man in an expensive jacket that screamed big city journalist, trying to look small-town casual. Elliot Price, if Michael remembered correctly from the byline in last week's paper about the mill closure's ongoing effects. Mr. Torres. Elliot Price, Millbrook Gazette. "I was hoping we could talk about yesterday's rescue. The whole town's buzzing about what you did." Michael glanced back at Lila, who was now standing on her chair to get a better look at their visitor. The smart thing would be to send the reporter away, keep his head down, avoid any attention that might complicate things with the custody hearing that was still looming like a storm cloud on his horizon. But Lila was looking at him with such pride, such uncomplicated admiration, that he found himself stepping aside to let Elliot in. "Coffee?" Michael offered, already moving toward the pot. His mother had raised him to offer hospitality even to people who made him nervous, especially to people who made him nervous. Elliot accepted gratefully, producing a digital recorder and a worn notebook from his jacket pocket. "I have to say, what you did yesterday was remarkable." No hesitation, straight into water that could have killed you both. "What was going through your mind?" Michael settled across from the reporter, very aware of Lila's presence at the edge of the conversation. "Wasn't thinking, really. Just saw a kid in trouble." "But you must have realized the danger. The current was strong enough that the fire chief said they wouldn't have attempted a water rescue without full gear and backup." "Maybe that's why I didn't think about it." Michael's fingers tightened around his coffee mug. "Sometimes thinking gets in the way of doing what needs to be done." Elliot's pen moved across the notebook with practiced efficiency. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Torres. You work at Peterson's?" "Part-time. I do warehouse work at Consolidated Freight early mornings, then help out at Peterson's loading dock. Weekends, I clean the community center." Michael heard how it sounded, the admission of a man scrambling to make ends meet, and felt heat creep up his neck. "That's a lot of work. You're raising your daughter alone?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Michael was acutely aware of Lila's suddenly still figure at the table, the way her spoon had stopped halfway to her mouth. This was dangerous territory, the place where heroic narratives collided with messy reality. "Lila lives with me," he said carefully. "Her mother and we share custody." It was technically true, though share was a generous interpretation of a situation where Vanessa allowed him supervised weekends and Wednesday dinners, always with the threat of full custody hanging over every interaction like a sword. Elliot's questions continued for another 20 minutes, carefully probing around the edges of Michael's life without quite crossing into the territory that would make him shut down completely. When the reporter finally left, promising the story would run in tomorrow's edition, Michael felt like he'd been holding his breath underwater again. His phone rang before he could process what had just happened. Vanessa's name appeared on the cracked screen, and Michael's brief moment of peace evaporated entirely. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass, the tone she reserved for when she felt he was getting above himself. "Margie called me this morning, said there's reporters asking questions about you at Lila's school. Van, I saved a kid's life. I didn't exactly plan the media attention. Don't you dare try to play the hero with me, Michael Torres. I know exactly what this is about. The custody hearing is next month. And suddenly you're some kind of community saint? You think Judge Whitman won't see right through this little performance? The irony hit him like a physical blow. Judge Charles Whitman, the man who would decide whether Michael deserved to keep his daughter in his life, was the same man whose son now owed his life to Michael's split-second decision to dive into dangerous water. "This isn't about the hearing," Michael said quietly, watching Lila pretend not to listen from the kitchen table. "This is about doing the right thing." The right thing. Vanessa's laugh was bitter. Like getting high while I was pregnant was the right thing? Like losing our apartment because you spent the rent money on pills was the right thing? One good deed doesn't erase 3 years of mistakes, Michael. And it sure as hell doesn't make you Father of the Year. The line went dead, leaving Michael staring at the phone while his daughter's eyes brimmed with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Outside, he could see Mrs. Henderson from next door peeking through her curtains, probably waiting to catch a glimpse of their newly famous neighbor. By evening, when the paper hit the stands, Michael knew there was no going back. Elliot had written a balanced piece, highlighting the heroism while hinting at the complexity underneath. The headline read, "Local Father Risks Life to Save Drowning Boy," accompanied by a photo someone had snapped of Michael emerging from the river, Henry's unconscious form cradled in his arms. He was no longer just another single father struggling to make it in a forgotten factory town. He was a symbol now, whether he wanted to be or not, and symbols carried weight that could either lift you up or crush you completely. The call came at 11:43 p.m., jolting Michael from the restless half-sleep he'd been managing since the newspaper hit the stands. Claudia Ramirez's voice was professionally neutral, but he could hear the underlying tension that came with late-night conversations about his fitness as a father. "Michael, we need to talk. Can you come in tomorrow morning? Early?" He sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What's wrong? Is it about the article?" "Just come in at 8. And Michael, bring documentation of your employment history for the past 6 months. Pay stubs, everything." The line went dead, leaving him staring at the ceiling while his mind raced through every possible disaster scenario. In the room next door, Lila slept peacefully, unaware that her world might be shifting beneath her feet again. Claudia's office at Child Protective Services occupied the second floor of a building that had housed everything from insurance companies to a short-lived dance studio over the past decade. The fluorescent lights gave everyone a sickly pallor, and the industrial carpet smelled faintly of disinfectant and broken dreams. Michael had spent enough time in these chairs to know exactly which ones wobbled and which ones had stuffing coming out of the arms. Claudia said without looking up from a thick folder that Michael recognized as his case file. She was younger than he'd expected when they first met 2 years ago, probably early 30s, with the kind of professional competence that came from dealing with too many disasters and not enough victories. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that suggested she'd given up, worrying about looking pretty somewhere around her 100th court appearance. "Your ex-wife called yesterday," she said, finally meeting his eyes. 3 times, actually. She's concerned about recent developments. Michael's hands tightened on the arms of the wobbling chair. "Concerned about what? That I saved a kid's life?" "Concerned that you're using this rescue as some kind of publicity stunt. She seems to think you've orchestrated this whole situation to influence the upcoming custody decision." Claudia's voice remained carefully neutral, but Michael caught the slight emphasis on "she seems to think," as if she wasn't entirely buying Vanessa's theory. "How exactly does she think I orchestrated a 9-year-old falling into the river?" The question came out sharper than he intended, tinged with the frustration that had been building since Vanessa's phone call. Claudia opened the folder and pulled out several printed pages that Michael recognized with a sinking heart. Police reports from 3 years ago, when his life had been measured in pills consumed and bills unpaid. Hospital records from the overdose that had finally scared him straight. Documentation from the rehab program that had given him the tools to rebuild himself from nothing. "She's asking me to review your history again. Specifically, she wants me to consider whether someone with your background should have been taking such risks. What if you'd drowned? What would have happened to Lila then?" The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because he'd been asking himself the same thing since he'd opened his eyes on that muddy riverbank. In the split second before he'd jumped into the water, he'd thought about Lila, about what would happen to her if he didn't come back. But then he'd seen Henry's terrified face disappearing under the surface, and all other considerations had evaporated. "I couldn't let that boy die," he said quietly. If that makes me unfit, then maybe I am. Claudia leaned back in her chair, studying him with eyes that had seen too many parents make promises they couldn't keep. Tell me about your mother. The question seemed to come from nowhere, but Michael had learned not to question Claudia's methods. She had a way of approaching problems sideways, finding the emotional truth beneath the legal documentation. Rosa Torres. She died 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. Fought it for 18 months before. He trailed off, surprised by how much it still hurt to talk about. She was proud of you, wasn't she, when you got clean? Michael nodded, not trusting his voice. His mother had lived just long enough to see him complete rehab, to hold Lila on her lap and tell her stories in Spanish about brave men who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. She died believing her son was finally becoming the man she'd raised him to be. What do you think she would have said about yesterday? The answer came without hesitation. She would have said, I did what any decent person does. You help when someone needs help, even if it costs you something. Claudia made a note in the file, her pen scratching against the paper with deliberate precision. Vanessa also mentioned that you've been having contact with the Whitman family, Judge Whitman's family. This was it, the trap he'd been walking toward since the moment he'd pulled Henry from the water. In a town the size of Millbrook, you couldn't save a judge's son without creating the appearance of impropriety, especially when that same judge would be ruling on your custody case. The boy wanted to thank me. His father drove him over yesterday evening. They stayed maybe 10 minutes. Talk about. Michael thought about Henry's wide eyes as he'd stammered through his thanks, the way the boy had asked if Michael had been scared in the water. If he'd known, they might both drown. He thought about Judge Whitman standing awkwardly in his doorway, clearly torn between gratitude and professional discomfort. Henry asked if I had kids. I told him about Lila. Judge Whitman thanked me and said they'd be praying for our family. Michael paused, then added quietly, he looked like a man who'd almost lost everything that mattered to him. Claudia closed the folder and leaned forward, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal something that might have been sympathy. Michael, I'm going to be straight with you. This rescue has complicated things. On one hand, it demonstrates exactly the kind of selfless character we want to see in a parent. On the other hand, it's created a situation that's going to be very difficult to navigate legally. Are you taking her away from me? The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Claudia was quiet for a long moment, staring at the folder that contained the documentation of his worst mistakes alongside the evidence of his redemption. Not today, she said finally. But Michael, you need to be very careful how you handle this. The custody hearing is in 3 weeks. Judge Whitman will likely recuse himself, which means we'll get someone from the county seat who doesn't know you, doesn't know your progress, and won't have any reason to see past your history to who you've become. As Michael left the building, stepping back into the crisp October air, he felt the weight of invisible eyes watching him. The local hero, the recovering addict, the devoted father, the man who'd complicated everyone's life by doing the right thing at the wrong time. He was all of those things simultaneously, and he had no idea which version of himself would be standing in that courtroom when his future with Lila was decided. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Torres, this is Judge Whitman. Could we speak privately? There are things we need to discuss. The playground at Millbrook Elementary occupied a patch of worn grass behind the brick building that had educated 3 generations of local children. Michael watched from his truck as Lila navigated the maze of swing sets and monkey bars with the careful precision of a child who'd learned early that making friends required strategy. He was 15 minutes early for pickup, a habit born from the paranoia that came with supervised custody, the constant fear that being even a minute late would somehow be used against him. That's when he saw Henry Whitman sitting alone on the far end of the playground, away from the clusters of children whose parents weren't judges, whose lives hadn't been splashed across the local newspaper. The boy was drawing circles in the dirt with a stick, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that reminded Michael of Lila when she was processing something too big for 8-year-old words. Lila must have noticed him too, because Michael watched her change direction mid-stride, abandoning the swing set to approach Henry with the kind of fearless kindness that broke his heart and made him proud in equal measure. She sat down beside him without invitation, close enough to be companionable, but far enough away to let him maintain his dignity. Michael couldn't hear their conversation from the truck, but he could read the body language of 2 children who understood something about being different, about carrying weight that other kids couldn't see. Henry's shoulders relaxed slightly. Lila leaned forward, listening with the intensity she usually reserved for bedtime stories. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to build the kind of friendship that adults spent years trying to recapture. "That's Judge Whitman's boy," said a voice behind Michael. He turned to find Janet Morrison, mother of Lila's classmate Emma, approaching with the carefully casual stride of someone who wanted to talk about something significant, while pretending it was just neighborhood gossip. "Yeah," Michael said, watching Lila show Henry how to skip stones using pieces of playground gravel. "Kids seem to be getting along." "For you?" Janet continued, settling against the fence beside his truck. "I mean, with everything that's happened, people are talking, you know." Michael knew. In a town like Millbrook, people talking was as inevitable as winter, and twice as cold. "What are they saying?" "Some folks think you're a hero. Others—" She shrugged, the gesture conveying more than words could. "Others think it's awfully convenient timing, with your custody situation and all." The implication hung between them like smoke. Michael had saved Judge Whitman's son just weeks before the same judge would decide whether Michael deserved to keep his own child. To some people, that looked like providence. To others, it looked like manipulation. "I didn't know who the boy was when I pulled him out," Michael said quietly. "Didn't matter then, doesn't matter now." Janet studied his face with the assessing look of a woman who'd raised 3 children and buried 1 husband. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. "Emma thinks Lila's lucky to have you as a dad. Kids see things differently than adults sometimes." Before Michael could respond, the school bell rang, sending children streaming toward the building like water finding its level. Lila and Henry stood up together, brushing dirt from their clothes with the unconscious synchronization of new allies. They walked toward the school side by side, talking animatedly about something that made Henry smile for the first time since Michael had seen him. That evening, as Michael helped Lila with her homework at their small kitchen table, she looked up from her math worksheet with the serious expression she wore when wrestling with big ideas. "Daddy," Henry asked if you were scared when you saved him. Michael set down his coffee mug, giving her question the attention it deserved. "Yeah, I was scared. The water was moving fast, and I wasn't sure I could get us both out safely. But you did it anyway." Sometimes being brave isn't about not being scared. Sometimes it's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway. Lila considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. Henry's scared too. His mom died last year, and he thinks his dad might send him away if he's too much trouble. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Here was another child navigating the treacherous waters of single parenthood, another family held together by love and determination, and the constant fear that it might not be enough. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that dads don't send kids away for being scared. I told him that you were scared lots of times when Mom left, but you never sent me away. I told him that being scared just means you understand how much you have to lose." Michael felt his throat tighten with pride and grief, and something that might have been hope. His 8-year-old daughter had somehow found words for truths that adults spent years learning to articulate. That was exactly the right thing to say. The next afternoon, when Judge Whitman's black sedan pulled up in front of their apartment building, Michael wasn't entirely surprised. He'd been expecting this conversation since Henry had mentioned wanting to see Lila again, since the careful balance of gratitude and professional distance had started to wobble under the weight of 2 children who didn't understand why adult complications should interfere with friendship. Henry emerged from the car first, nearly vibrating with excitement, followed by his father, who moved with the measured stride of a man approaching a conversation he wasn't sure how to navigate. Judge Whitman was younger than Michael had expected, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of sharp eyes that came from years of parsing truth from fiction in courtrooms. "Mr. Torres," the judge said, extending his hand with formal courtesy, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Henry has been asking about Lil all week." The offered hand, noting the firm grip and the way Judge Whitman's eyes took in the modest apartment building, the working-class neighborhood, the evidence of a life lived without excess but with dignity. "Lila's been asking about Henry too. Would you like to come up? I've got coffee." For a moment, Michael thought the judge might decline, might maintain the professional distance that would be safer for both of them. But then, Henry was tugging on his father's sleeve. pointing toward the building with the enthusiasm of a boy who'd found someone who understood his particular brand of quiet courage. "Coffee would be good," Judge Whitman said finally. "We should talk." As they climbed the narrow stairs to Michael's second-floor apartment, both men carrying the weight of everything they couldn't say directly, the children raced ahead, already planning adventures that existed in the space between their complicated adult worlds. Michael unlocked his door knowing that this conversation would change everything, and hoping that change didn't always have to mean loss. The Millbrook Community Center hadn't hosted an event this well-attended since the paper mill's closure announcement 5 years ago. Every folding chair in the main hall was occupied, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the lobby, their conversations creating a low hum of anticipation that made Michael's skin crawl with anxiety. He stood in the small side room that usually served as storage for holiday decorations, trying to steady his breathing while Mayor Patricia Hendricks fussed with his borrowed tie. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You look fine, honey," she said, stepping back to assess her work. Pat Hendricks had been mayor for 12 years, elected originally because she'd been the only candidate willing to take on a job that paid in headaches and heartbreak. She had the kind of practical wisdom that came from raising 5 children and managing a hardware store, and right now she was the closest thing Michael had to an ally in a room full of people who wanted to turn his split-second decision into something larger than life. "I still think this is a mistake," Michael said, tugging at the collar that felt like a noose around his neck. "I don't need a ceremony. I don't need recognition." "It's not about what you need," Pat said, her voice carrying the gentle firmness she used on city council members who forgot their manners. "This town needs something good to celebrate. We've had nothing but bad news for years. Let people feel proud of something for once." Through the thin wall, Michael could hear Elliot Price introducing the evening's program, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who understood that tonight's story would be bigger than Millbrook's usual news cycle. The rescue had caught the attention of regional media, bringing cameras and reporters from Lansing and Grand Rapids, transforming what should have been a simple thank you into something that felt uncomfortably like a political rally. "Mr. Torres?" A young woman with a press badge poked her head through the door. "We're ready for you." Michael followed her into the main hall, immediately hit by the heat of too many bodies in too small a space and the blinding flash of camera strobes. The applause started before he'd taken 3 steps, building to something that felt more like vindication than celebration, and he found himself searching the crowd for familiar faces to anchor himself against the surreal quality of the moment. Lila sat in the front row, practically glowing with pride, her small hands clapping with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never doubted her father was a hero. Beside her, Henry Whitman clapped more tentatively, his eyes wide as he took in the spectacle that had grown around his near drowning. And in the second row, Judge Whitman sat with the carefully neutral expression of a man trying to balance personal gratitude with professional obligation. But it was the sight of Vanessa standing near the back wall that made Michael's stomach clench with dread. She dressed carefully for the occasion, her blonde hair styled and her makeup perfect, but her expression carried the cold fury of someone who felt she was watching an elaborate con game play out in front of the entire community. At the podium first, delivering remarks about community spirit and everyday heroes that felt both genuine and carefully crafted to avoid anything that might be construed as commentary on Michael's pending custody case. When she called him forward to accept a medal from the local VFW, Michael moved on autopilot, his mind still processing the sight of Vanessa's angry face in the crowd. "Michael Torres represents the best of what we are as a community," the mayor said as she hung the medal around his neck. In a moment of crisis, he didn't hesitate, didn't calculate the risk to himself, didn't worry about whether saving a stranger's child was his responsibility. He simply acted, with the kind of courage that reminds us what it means to be human. The applause was deafening, but Michael barely heard it over the sound of his own heartbeat. When the mayor stepped aside and indicated he should say something, he approached the microphone with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. "I'm not good with speeches," he began, his voice cracking slightly before settling into something steadier. "But I want to say that what happened at the river, that wasn't heroism. That was just what any parent would do if they saw a child in danger." He paused, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Henry's earnest face in the front row. "I have a daughter who means everything to me. When I saw Henry in that water, I didn't see a stranger's kid. I saw every parent's worst nightmare, and I knew I had to act. Someone in the back of the room shouted, "Hero!" and others picked up the chant, but Michael held up his hand for quiet. If I'm a hero for saving Henry, then Henry's a hero for fighting so hard to stay alive until I could reach him. Judge Whitman's a hero for raising a son brave enough to keep fighting when everything looked hopeless. My daughter's a hero for reminding me every day why it's worth being the kind of man who doesn't think twice about diving into dangerous water. The applause that followed felt different, more personal, and Michael allowed himself to believe for a moment that maybe this public attention wouldn't destroy everything he'd worked to build. Then Vanessa stepped forward from the back of the room, and Michael's brief moment of hope evaporated like morning mist. "That's a beautiful speech, Michael," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden quiet. "But I have to ask, how does one act of heroism erase years of mistakes? How does saving one child prove that a man who lost custody of his own daughter because of drug addiction deserves to be called a hero?" The silence that followed was deafening. Michael felt every eye in the room turn toward him, felt the weight of judgment settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. In the front row, Lila's face crumpled with confusion and hurt, and Judge Whitman's carefully neutral expression shifted into something that might have been concern. Elliot Price was already moving toward Vanessa with his recorder extended, sensing the kind of dramatic twist that transformed local interest stories into regional headlines. The cameras swiveled to capture her face as she continued speaking, her words precise and calculated to inflict maximum damage. "I'm not saying Michael doesn't deserve credit for what he did, but let's not pretend that one good deed makes him Father of the Year. Some of us remember the man who chose drugs over his family, who put his own child at risk, who's only fighting for custody now because he can't accept responsibility for the choices he made." Michael stood frozen at the podium, watching his moment of triumph transform into public humiliation, knowing that anything he said now would only make things worse. In the crowd, he could see people shifting uncomfortably, their celebrations souring into something that felt more like a trial. The evening that was supposed to honor his courage had become an indictment of his past, and Michael realized with crystal clarity that heroism, like everything else in his life, came with a price that seemed designed to break him. The coffee in Charles Whitman's office had gone cold hours ago, but he continued to hold the mug like an anchor, staring out his window at the river that had changed everything. From the third floor of the courthouse, he could see the exact spot where Michael Torres had pulled Henry from the water, and the irony wasn't lost on him that his office overlooked the scene of the act that had made his life infinitely more complicated. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Charles had spent the better part of 3 sleepless nights wrestling with a decision that should have been simple. Legal ethics demanded he recuse himself from any case involving Michael Torres. Personal gratitude demanded he find a way to ensure that the man who'd saved his son received fair treatment. Professional integrity demanded he find a path between those competing obligations that wouldn't compromise either his judicial authority or his conscience. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in." His clerk, Jennifer Matthews, entered with the careful expression of someone who'd worked for judges long enough to recognize the signs of a man wrestling with impossible choices. "The Torres custody file is on your desk. The motion for recusal is filed and ready for your signature." Charles nodded without looking at the folder. Once he signed that motion, the case would be transferred to Judge Patricia Morrison in the county seat, a competent jurist who would approach Michael's fitness as a parent with the cold objectivity that the law required. Morrison wouldn't know about Michael's daily struggles to make ends meet, his devotion to Lila, or the quiet dignity with which he'd handled the aftermath of his public humiliation. She would see only the documentation of past failures and the current custody dispute. "There's something else," Jennifer said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Henry's been asking to see Mr. Torres again. He wants to invite Lila over for dinner." Charles set down his coffee mug with more force than necessary. "Absolutely not." "Sir?" "Jennifer, I cannot have any social contact with a man whose custody case was supposed to be in my courtroom. The appearance of impropriety would be devastating, regardless of my decision to recuse myself." But even as he said the words, Charles could picture Henry's disappointed face, could remember his son's animated description of how Lila had explained that scared fathers don't abandon their children, they just hold on tighter. Since the rescue, Henry had shown more emotional openness than Charles had seen since his wife's death, as if Michael's act of courage had given the boy permission to believe in the possibility of safety again. "He's making progress," Jennifer said quietly. She'd been working for Charles since before Henry was born, had watched him struggle through the terrible months after Susan's cancer diagnosis, had seen how grief had settled between father and son like a wall neither knew how to breach. The school counselor says he's participating more in class, engaging with other children. She thinks this friendship with Lila is part of his healing process. Charles rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar ache that came from trying to balance competing demands. And what happens when Judge Morrison rules against Torres? What happens when Henry watches his new friend lose her father? How does that help his healing process? The question hung between them, unanswered because there was no good answer. Charles had read Michael's file thoroughly, had seen the documentation of addiction and instability that would weigh heavily in any custody decision, but he'd also witnessed the man's character firsthand, had seen how Michael's eyes had filled with tears when Henry thanked him for the rescue, had noticed the gentle way he'd guided Lila through the crowd at the community center ceremony, even as his ex-wife was destroying his reputation in front of the entire town. "Judge Morrison called this morning," Jennifer said carefully. "She's reviewed the preliminary file. She wanted to know if you had any observations about the case that might inform her decision." Charles looked up sharply. "What did you tell her?" "That any observations you might have would be inappropriate to share, given your recusal." It was the correct answer, the ethical answer, but it felt like cowardice. Charles had information that could influence whether a good man kept his daughter, and legal protocol demanded he remain silent, while someone else made a decision based on incomplete understanding. His phone buzzed with a text message from his babysitter. "Henry asking again about Lila. Should I tell him you said no?" Charles stared at the message, thinking about his son's shy smile when he had described teaching Lila to skip stones, about the way Henry had started talking about school again instead of just enduring it. The boy had lost his mother to cancer, and was slowly losing his father to the emotional numbness that had settled over Charles like armor. If Michael Torres could help Henry heal, didn't Charles owe it to his son to find a way to preserve that connection? But preserving it meant risking everything he'd built in 15 years on the bench. It meant choosing between his duty as a judge and his obligations as a father, between his professional integrity and his personal gratitude. When it came, felt like surrender rather than choice. Jennifer drafted a letter to Judge Morrison. Explain that while I cannot comment on the specifics of the Torres case, I believe she should be aware that Mr. Torres has demonstrated remarkable character in his interactions with my family following my son's accident. Include a copy of the police report from the rescue, and make sure she understands that his actions potentially saved not just Henry's life, but my ability to continue functioning as both a judge and a father. Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly. Sir, that's walking very close to the line of appropriate judicial conduct. I know exactly where the line is, Charles said firmly, and I'm staying on the right side of it while making sure that a fellow father gets the fair consideration he deserves. As Jennifer left to draft the letter, Charles turned back to the window overlooking the river. In 3 days, Michael Torres would stand before Judge Morrison and fight for the right to keep his daughter. Charles would sit in his office, bound by ethics and protocol to remain silent, while another person decided whether the man who'd saved his son deserved to keep his own child. It wasn't justice, but it was the best approximation of fairness that Charles could manage while still sleeping at night. He only hoped it would be enough to tip the scales toward the kind of outcome that honored both the law and the truth of who Michael Torres had become. Outside his window, the river continued its eternal flow toward the lake, carrying with it the memory of one man's courage and the weight of another man's impossible choice. The courthouse in Cedar Falls smelled of industrial cleaner and old wood, a combination that made Michael's stomach turn as he sat beside his court-appointed attorney in the gallery of Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom. Sarah Kellerman was competent enough, a public defender who'd handled dozens of custody cases with the weary efficiency of someone who'd learned not to get emotionally invested in outcomes she couldn't control. She'd spent exactly 43 minutes reviewing Michael's file before this morning's hearing, and her optimism was about as substantial as morning fog. Remember, she whispered as they waited for Judge Morrison to take the bench, answer only what's asked. Don't volunteer information. Don't let them bait you into defending your past when you should be talking about your present. Michael nodded, though his attention kept drifting to the gallery behind him, where Lila sat between Henry Whitman and Mrs. Peterson from the flower shop, who'd volunteered to supervise the children during the hearing. Judge Whitman had arranged for Henry to attend, claiming the boy needed to see how the legal system worked, but Michael suspected the real reason was more complex than educational curiosity. Vanessa entered through the back doors of the courtroom with her attorney, David Carlisle, a man who'd built his reputation on high-conflict divorces and custody battles. Carlisle moved with the predatory confidence of someone who specialized in finding weaknesses and exploiting them for maximum damage. He'd been preparing for this moment since the rescue, building a narrative that painted Michael's heroism as calculated manipulation rather than genuine courage. Judge Morrison took the bench at exactly 9 a.m., a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd heard every sob story and legal maneuver at least twice. She reviewed the file briefly before calling the proceedings to order. This is a custody modification hearing in the matter of Torres versus Grant. Ms. Grant is seeking full custody of the minor child Lila Torres, currently age 8. Judge Morrison's voice carried the measured neutrality of someone who'd learned to treat family destruction as administrative business. Mr. Carlisle, you may proceed with your opening statement. Carlisle stood with theatrical precision, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair, a sharp contrast to Michael's borrowed jacket and second-hand tie. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about stability, responsibility, and what's in the best interests of an 8-year-old child who deserves better than to be used as a prop in her father's ongoing attempts at self-rehabilitation. The opening salvo hit its mark, and Michael felt Sarah tense beside him. Carlisle continued with the methodical destruction of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. Mr. Torres has a documented history of substance abuse, financial instability, and poor judgment that resulted in the loss of primary custody 3 years ago. Nothing has fundamentally changed except for a single incident of supposed heroism that he and his supporters are using to rewrite history. But, Your Honor, being a hero for 5 minutes doesn't erase being an addict for 3 years. Himself to remain still, as Carlisle laid out the evidence of his failures with prosecutorial precision. The eviction notices, the missed visitation appointments during his worst months, the police reports from the night he'd overdosed while Lila slept in the next room. Facts presented without context, truth stripped of nuance, his worst moments preserved in legal documents that made no allowance for redemption or growth. When Sarah stood to deliver her opening statement, her voice lacked Carlisle's theatrical confidence, but it carried something more valuable: authenticity. Your Honor, this case is indeed about what's best for Lila Torres. And what's best for her is maintaining her relationship with a father who has demonstrated through 3 years of consistent sobriety, steady employment, and devoted parenting that people can change, can grow, and can become better than their worst mistakes. The testimony began with Vanessa taking the stand, her voice steady as she described the chaos of Michael's addiction, the fear of coming home to find him unconscious, the responsibility of shielding Lila from the reality of her father's condition. Her pain was genuine, her concerns legitimate, and Michael couldn't bring himself to resent her for speaking truths that still kept him awake at night. He was a good man once, Vanessa said when Carlisle asked about their early relationship. But addiction changes people. It makes them unreliable, unpredictable, dangerous. And I can't risk Lila's safety on the hope that this time will be different. Under cross-examination, Sarah managed to establish that Michael had maintained his sobriety for over 3 years, had never missed a scheduled visitation, and had provided consistent financial support despite his limited income. But the damage was done, the foundation laid for a narrative of fundamental unfitness that one act of heroism couldn't overcome. Claudia Ramirez took the stand next, her testimony careful and professional as she described Michael's progress while acknowledging the legitimate concerns about his history. She spoke about his consistent attendance at parenting classes, his stable housing, his genuine love for Lila, but her words carried the cautious tone of someone who'd been disappointed by parents who'd seemed reformed until they weren't. Mr. Torres has shown remarkable dedication to his recovery and to his relationship with his daughter, she said under direct examination. However, addiction is a chronic condition, and relapse is always a possibility that must be considered when determining what's in a child's best interests. When Carlisle cross-examined her, he focused relentlessly on the rescue, suggesting that Michael's sudden prominence was influencing her assessment. "Ms. Ramirez, isn't it true that prior to this highly publicized rescue, your reports consistently recommended against expanded custody for Mr. Torres?" Claudia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "My recommendations have evolved as Mr. Torres has demonstrated sustained progress. But the timing of this evolution, coming immediately after Mr. Torres became a local celebrity, doesn't strike you as potentially influenced by factors other than his actual fitness as a parent." The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Michael watched Claudia struggle with an answer that would be both honest and fair, knowing that her response could determine his future with Lila. "I believe Mr. Torres's actions during the rescue demonstrate exactly the kind of character we want to see in a parent," she said finally. "Someone who acts selflessly to protect children, even at personal risk. That's not celebrity, Mr. Carlyle. That's the measure of a man." The afternoon brought character witnesses from Michael, Mrs. Peterson describing his courtesy and work ethic, his supervisor from the warehouse praising his reliability, his sponsor from AA testifying about his commitment to sobriety. Each spoke with genuine affection and respect, painting a picture of a man who'd rebuilt himself from nothing through sheer determination and love for his daughter. But when Elliot Price took the stand, called by Carlyle to testify about the media attention surrounding the rescue, the hearing took a darker turn. "Would you say Mr. Torres sought out this publicity?" Carlyle asked. "Not initially," Elliot admitted, "but he certainly hasn't shied away from it. The rescue has become central to his public identity, and timing-wise, it couldn't have been more beneficial for his custody case. In your professional opinion as a journalist, does the timing of this rescue seem coincidental?" Sarah objected before Elliot could answer, but the implication had been planted. As the day wore on, Michael felt the weight of suspicion settling over the courtroom like fog, transforming his moment of courage into something calculated and manipulative. Peterson called for a recess before closing arguments. Michael stepped outside the courthouse and found Henry Whitman standing by the steps, his young face tight with an anger that seemed too mature for his 9 years. "They're making it sound like you planned it," Henry said, his voice shaking with indignation. "Like you knew I was going to fall in and you waited to save me for the cameras." Michael knelt down to Henry's eye level, seeing his own daughter's face reflected in the boy's fierce loyalty. "Some people need to make sense of things by making them smaller than they are. But you and I know what really happened in that water, don't we?" Henry nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I know you almost died saving me. I know you didn't think about anything except getting me out." As they walked back into the courthouse for closing arguments, Michael realized that regardless of Judge Morrison's decision, he'd already received the only validation that truly mattered: the trust of a child who understood the difference between performance and truth, between heroism and humanity. The recess had stretched longer than expected as Judge Morrison reviewed the extensive documentation, leaving the courthouse steps crowded with people waiting for the proceedings to resume. Michael stood near the base of the granite steps, trying to find space to breathe in the October air that felt thick with anticipation and judgment. The lawyers huddled in separate corners like opposing teams planning final strategies, while court watchers and family members milled about in the uncomfortable limbo between testimony and verdict. Henry Whitman had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the afternoon, his small hands clenched into fists as he listened to his father's rescue being dissected and questioned by strangers who hadn't been there, who couldn't understand what it meant to feel the river trying to claim your life. Judge Whitman had remained inside the courthouse, conducting other business while the custody hearing remained in recess, leaving Henry in the care of Mrs. Peterson, who was doing her best to manage 2 anxious children in an environment designed for adult drama. "This is wrong," Henry said suddenly, his voice carrying the sharp edge of anger that had been building all day. "They're making Daddy sound like a bad person. They're saying you didn't really save me." Lila, who'd been unusually quiet since her mother's testimony, reached for Henry's hand with the instinctive kindness that had made their friendship so natural. "Sometimes grown-ups get confused about things that are really simple." "But they're going to take you away," Henry said, his voice cracking with the kind of desperation that children feel when they realize adults don't always make fair decisions. "Just like they took my mom away, and there's nothing anyone can do about it." Michael felt his heart clench at the boy's words, recognizing the helpless rage that came from watching forces beyond your control reshape your world. Henry's mother had died of cancer 18 months ago, a loss that no amount of legal argument or character testimony could reverse. Now the boy was watching another parent face the possibility of separation, and the parallels were too painful for a 9-year-old mind to process. "Henry," Michael said gently, kneeling down to the boy's level, "what happened to your mom was different. Nobody's going to take your dad away from you." "But they might take Lila away from you," Henry said, tears starting to flow despite his efforts to maintain control. "And it's not fair. You saved me. You almost died saving me, and now they're punishing you for it." The crowd on the courthouse steps was beginning to take notice of the distressed boy, conversations quieting as people turned to watch the drama unfolding. Michael could see Elliot Price moving closer with his notebook out, sensing another angle for his ongoing coverage of the Torres family's legal struggles. "I can't do this anymore," Henry said suddenly, pulling away from both Michael and Lila. "I can't listen to them talk about you like you're a bad person, when you're the best person I know." React. Henry was running, not toward the courthouse doors where his father waited, but down the steps and across the street toward the park that bordered the river. His legs moved with the desperate speed of someone fleeing from unbearable truth, and Michael's heart stopped as he realized where the boy was heading. "Henry!" Michael called, already moving down the steps after him. Behind him, he could hear Mrs. Peterson's alarmed voice, Lila's frightened cry, and the sudden rush of people realizing that something was going wrong. The boy reached the park and kept running, heading straight for the walking path that followed the river's edge. Michael pumped his legs harder, his dress shoes slipping on the damp grass as he fought to close the distance. Henry was fast, driven by the kind of panicked energy that gave children superhuman speed when they were running from pain they couldn't articulate. "Henry, stop!" Michael shouted. But the boy kept running toward the same stretch of river where everything had started 6 weeks ago. The water level was higher now, swollen by recent rains, and the seasonal runoff that made the current even more dangerous than it had been on the day of the rescue. Henry reached the riverbank and stopped abruptly, standing at the edge of the water with his chest heaving from exertion and emotion. Michael could see the boy's shoulders shaking with sobs as he stared down at the rushing water that had nearly claimed his life. "I should have just drowned," Henry said when Michael reached him, his voice barely audible over the sound of the current. "Then you wouldn't have saved me, and you wouldn't be in trouble, and Lila wouldn't have to lose her dad because of me." The words hit Michael like physical blows. This was trauma speaking, the terrible logic of a child who'd lost one parent and was now watching another family face destruction. Henry's young mind had made the connection between his rescue and Michael's legal troubles, creating a burden of guilt that no 9-year-old should have to carry. "Henry, look at me," Michael said, keeping his voice calm despite the fear that was making his hands shake. "What happened to you in the river wasn't your fault. What's happening in that courtroom isn't your fault either. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and sometimes good things come from bad situations, but none of that is about blame." "But if I hadn't fallen in?" "If you hadn't fallen in, I never would have met you," Michael said firmly. "I never would have known what a brave, kind, smart kid you are. Lila never would have found a friend who understands what it's like to be scared about losing someone you love. Your dad never would have seen that even when things look hopeless, people still fight to save each other." Henry turned away from the water to look at Michael, his face streaked with tears but his expression slowly shifting from despair to something that might have been hope. "You don't regret saving me?" "Never," Michael said without hesitation. "Not for 1 second. Saving you was the most important thing I've ever done, and whatever happens in that courtroom doesn't change that." Behind them, Michael could hear voices approaching as people from the courthouse caught up to them. Judge Whitman's voice carried above the others, sharp with the fear that every parent recognizes when their child is in danger. "Henry!" The boy turned toward his father's voice, and Michael could see the moment when Henry's panic began to subside, replaced by the security of knowing that someone who loved him was coming to make things safe again. Judge Whitman reached them at a run, dropping to his knees to gather his son into his arms with the desperate relief of someone who'd almost lost everything that mattered. "I'm sorry, Dad," Henry sobbed against his father's shoulder. "I just couldn't stand listening to them anymore. They don't understand what really happened." Judge Whitman held his son tightly, his eyes meeting Michael's over Henry's head with an expression that contained gratitude, understanding, and something that might have been respect. For a moment, the careful distance that professional ethics demanded between them dissolved, leaving only two fathers who understood the weight of protecting children in a world that didn't always make sense. "They understand now," Judge Whitman said quietly, and Michael realized that half the courthouse had followed them to the riverbank, including Judge Morrison herself, who stood watching with the assessing gaze of someone who was seeing the case from an entirely different perspective. Back to the courthouse together, Henry safely positioned between his father and Michael. The crowd that had gathered parted to let them pass. The hearing would resume, closing arguments would be made, and Judge Morrison would render her decision. But Michael knew that something fundamental had shifted in those desperate minutes by the river, something that transcended legal arguments and character witnesses. He'd saved Henry Whitman twice now, once from drowning and once from despair, and in doing so had proven the kind of father he'd become, not through testimony, but through instinct and love, and the willingness to put a child's needs before his own safety. The courtroom felt different when they reconvened after the incident at the river. Judge Morrison took the bench with the measured deliberation of someone who'd witnessed something that had fundamentally altered her understanding of the case before her. The gallery was fuller now, word having spread through the small legal community about the dramatic scene that had played out on the courthouse steps and riverbank. Even the court reporter seemed more alert, sensing that the routine custody hearing had transformed into something more significant. "Before we proceed with closing arguments," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years on the bench, "I want to address what occurred during our recess. While it's unusual for events outside the courtroom to influence proceedings, what I witnessed today provides relevant insight into the character and instincts of the parties involved." Michael felt Sarah tense beside him. Unplanned incidents could cut either way in custody proceedings, and there was no predicting how Judge Morrison would interpret Henry's breakdown and Michael's response. "Mr. Carlyle, you may proceed with your closing argument." Carlyle stood with less theatrical flourish than he'd displayed during his opening statement. The incident with Henry had clearly disrupted his carefully planned narrative, forcing him to adapt his strategy in real time. "Your Honor, while the events of today certainly demonstrate Mr. Torres's compassion, they also highlight the ongoing complications that surround his involvement with the Whitman family. This custody case has become entangled with media attention, public opinion, and circumstances that have nothing to do with Mr. Torres's fitness as a parent." He paused, seeming to recalculate his approach. "The central question remains. Has Mr. Torres demonstrated the consistent stability and responsible judgment that Lila needs? His history of addiction, financial struggles, and poor decision-making created the circumstances that led to this custody dispute. One act of heroism, however genuine, cannot erase 3 years of documented failures." But even as Carlyle spoke, his words seemed to lack the conviction they'd carried earlier in the day. The image of Michael calmly talking Henry away from the river's edge had undermined the portrayal of him as an unstable, manipulative figure seeking to exploit his rescue for legal advantage. Mrs. Grant has provided a stable, secure home environment with consistent rules, educational support, and financial security. She has never struggled with addiction, never faced eviction, never put Lila at risk through poor judgment. The choice before this court should be clear: a mother who has consistently provided stability versus a father whose commitment to sobriety, while admirable, remains an ongoing gamble with his daughter's welfare. When Carlyle sat down, the courtroom was quieter than it had been all day. Michael noticed that several of the observers were looking at him with expressions that seemed more sympathetic than they had been before Henry's crisis. Sarah stood for her closing argument, with more confidence than she'd shown at any point during the proceedings. The incident at the river had given her exactly the kind of real-world demonstration of Michael's character that no amount of testimony could provide. "Your Honor, Mr. Carlyle is correct that this case has become complicated by circumstances beyond anyone's control. But those complications have actually provided this court with a unique opportunity to see exactly who Michael Torres is as a person and as a parent." She moved away from the podium, speaking directly to Judge Morrison with the conviction of someone who finally had the right story to tell. Mr. Torres saw a child in danger and risked his own life to save that child. Today, he saw that same child in emotional crisis and again put the boy's needs before his own welfare. Both times, he acted instinctively, without calculation, without concern for how his actions might be perceived or what consequences they might bring. Sarah gestured toward the gallery where Lila sat beside Mrs. Peterson, the 8-year-old's face bright with pride in her father despite the day's emotional turmoil. "That's who Michael Torres is, not the man who struggled with addiction 3 years ago, but the man who has spent every day since then proving that people can change, can grow, can become better than their worst mistakes. Lila doesn't need a perfect father. She needs a father who will jump into dangerous water to save a stranger's child, who will talk a traumatized boy away from despair, who will show up every day with love and commitment, and the kind of moral courage that can't be faked or manufactured for legal proceedings. Judge Morrison listened with the impassive expression that experienced judges cultivate, but Michael thought he detected a slight softening around her eyes as Sarah continued. Mr. Carlyle speaks of stability, and he's right that it matters. But there's more than one kind of stability. There's the stability of financial security and consistent housing, which Mrs. Grant undoubtedly provides. And there's the stability of unconditional love, of knowing that your parent will always fight for you, will always put your needs first, will always be the kind of person you can be proud to call dad. Sarah returned to her seat, and Judge Morrison called for a brief recess to consider her decision. Michael stepped outside with Lila, who immediately wrapped her arms around his waist with the fierce devotion of a child who understood that her world was about to be decided by a stranger. "Whatever happens," Michael told her quietly, "you need to know that you're the best thing that ever happened to me. You're the reason I got clean, the reason I keep fighting, the reason I became someone worth saving." 20 minutes later, they were back in the courtroom as Judge Morrison prepared to deliver her ruling. The judge looked directly at Michael as she began to speak, her expression grave but not unkind. "In 15 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered a case that so clearly illustrates the complexity of human nature and the difficulty of balancing competing interests in the best welfare of a child. Mr. Torres, your history of addiction and the circumstances that led to this custody dispute cannot be ignored or minimized. The court must consider the possibility of relapse and the potential impact on Lila's welfare." Michael's heart sank, but Judge Morrison continued without pause. "However, the court has also observed compelling evidence of genuine rehabilitation, consistent progress, and most importantly, the kind of instinctive moral character that cannot be taught or simulated. The events of today, both Mr. Torres's rescue of Henry Whitman 6 weeks ago and his response to the boy's crisis this afternoon, demonstrate exactly the kind of judgment and priorities we hope to see in parents." She paused, looking at both Vanessa and Michael with equal attention. Mrs. Grant's concerns about stability are legitimate and understandable. However, stability must be measured not only in terms of financial resources and consistent housing, but in terms of emotional security and the knowledge that one is unconditionally loved and protected. Judge Morrison shuffled the papers before her with deliberate care. "Therefore, this court awards joint physical custody of Lila Torres, with primary residence alternating monthly between both parents. Mr. Torres, this decision comes with the condition that you maintain your sobriety and continue with counseling and parenting support services. Any violation of these terms will result in immediate review of this arrangement." The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo in Michael's chest like a heartbeat. Lila burst into tears of relief, throwing herself into his arms with such force that it nearly knocked him from his chair. Behind them, he could hear congratulations from Mrs. Peterson and other supporters, but the only sound that really mattered was his daughter's whispered, "I love you, Daddy," against his ear. Across the courtroom, Vanessa sat with Carlyle, her face a mixture of disappointment and something that might have been reluctant respect. She looked at Michael for a long moment, and he saw in her expression the acknowledgement that he had indeed become someone different from the man she'd divorced. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the courthouse, Judge Whitman approached with Henry, who immediately hugged Michael with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd found a hero worthy of his admiration. "For you," Janet continued, settling against the fence beside his truck. "I mean, with everything that's happened, people are talking, you know." Michael knew. In a town like Millbrook, people talking was as inevitable as winter, and twice as cold. "What are they saying?" "Some folks think you're a hero. Others—" She shrugged, the gesture conveying more than words could. "Others think it's awfully convenient timing, with your custody situation and all." The implication hung between them like smoke. Michael had saved Judge Whitman's son just weeks before the same judge would decide whether Michael deserved to keep his own child. To some people, that looked like providence. To others, it looked like manipulation. "I didn't know who the boy was when I pulled him out," Michael said quietly. "Didn't matter then, doesn't matter now." Janet studied his face with the assessing look of a woman who'd raised 3 children and buried 1 husband. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. Emma thinks Lila's lucky to have you as a dad. Kids see things differently than adults sometimes. Before Michael could respond, the school bell rang, sending children streaming toward the building like water finding its level. Lila and Henry stood up together, brushing dirt from their clothes with the unconscious synchronization of new allies. They walked toward the school side by side, talking animatedly about something that made Henry smile for the first time since Michael had seen him. That evening, as Michael helped Lila with her homework at their small kitchen table, she looked up from her math worksheet with the serious expression she wore when wrestling with big ideas. "Daddy," Henry asked if you were scared when you saved him. Michael set down his coffee mug, giving her question the attention it deserved. "Yeah, I was scared. The water was moving fast, and I wasn't sure I could get us both out safely. But you did it anyway." Sometimes being brave isn't about not being scared. Sometimes it's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway. Lila considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. Henry's scared too. His mom died last year, and he thinks his dad might send him away if he's too much trouble. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Here was another child navigating the treacherous waters of single parenthood, another family held together by love and determination, and the constant fear that it might not be enough. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that dads don't send kids away for being scared. I told him that you were scared lots of times when Mom left, but you never sent me away. I told him that being scared just means you understand how much you have to lose." Michael felt his throat tighten with pride and grief, and something that might have been hope. His 8-year-old daughter had somehow found words for truths that adults spent years learning to articulate. That was exactly the right thing to say. The next afternoon, when Judge Whitman's black sedan pulled up in front of their apartment building, Michael wasn't entirely surprised. He'd been expecting this conversation since Henry had mentioned wanting to see Lila again, since the careful balance of gratitude and professional distance had started to wobble under the weight of two children who didn't understand why adult complications should interfere with friendship. Henry emerged from the car first, nearly vibrating with excitement, followed by his father, who moved with the measured stride of a man approaching a conversation he wasn't sure how to navigate. Judge Whitman was younger than Michael had expected, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of sharp eyes that came from years of parsing truth from fiction in courtrooms. "Mr. Torres," the judge said, extending his hand with formal courtesy, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Henry has been asking about Lil all week." The offered hand, noting the firm grip and the way Judge Whitman's eyes took in the modest apartment building, the working-class neighborhood, the evidence of a life lived without excess but with dignity. "Lila's been asking about Henry too. Would you like to come up? I've got coffee." For a moment, Michael thought the judge might decline, might maintain the professional distance that would be safer for both of them. But then, Henry was tugging on his father's sleeve, pointing toward the building with the enthusiasm of a boy who'd found someone who understood his particular brand of quiet courage. "Coffee would be good," Judge Whitman said finally. "We should talk." As they climbed the narrow stairs to Michael's second-floor apartment, both men carrying the weight of everything they couldn't say directly, the children raced ahead, already planning adventures that existed in the space between their complicated adult worlds. Michael unlocked his door knowing that this conversation would change everything, and hoping that change didn't always have to mean loss. The Millbrook Community Center hadn't hosted an event this well attended since the paper mill's closure announcement 5 years ago. Every folding chair in the main hall was occupied, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the lobby, their conversations creating a low hum of anticipation that made Michael's skin crawl with anxiety. He stood in the small side room that usually served as storage for holiday decorations, trying to steady his breathing while Mayor Patricia Hendricks fussed with his borrowed tie. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You look fine, honey," she said, stepping back to assess her work. Pat Hendricks had been mayor for 12 years, elected originally because she'd been the only candidate willing to take on a job that paid in headaches and heartbreak. She had the kind of practical wisdom that came from raising 5 children and managing a hardware store, and right now she was the closest thing Michael had to an ally in a room full of people who wanted to turn his split-second decision into something larger than life. "I still think this is a mistake," Michael said, tugging at the collar that felt like a noose around his neck. "I don't need a ceremony, I don't need recognition." "It's not about what you need," Pat said, her voice carrying the gentle firmness she used on city council members who forgot their manners. "This town needs something good to celebrate. We've had nothing but bad news for years. Let people feel proud of something for once." Through the thin wall, Michael could hear Elliot Price introducing the evening's program, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who understood that tonight's story would be bigger than Millbrook's usual news cycle. The rescue had caught the attention of regional media, bringing cameras and reporters from Lansing and Grand Rapids, transforming what should have been a simple thank you into something that felt uncomfortably like a political rally. "Mr. Torres?" A young woman with a press badge poked her head through the door. "We're ready for you." Michael followed her into the main hall, immediately hit by the heat of too many bodies in too small a space and the blinding flash of camera strobes. The applause started before he'd taken 3 steps, building to something that felt more like vindication than celebration, and he found himself searching the crowd for familiar faces to anchor himself against the surreal quality of the moment. Lila sat in the front row, practically glowing with pride, her small hands clapping with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never doubted her father was a hero. Beside her, Henry Whitman clapped more tentatively, his eyes wide as he took in the spectacle that had grown around his near drowning. And in the second row, Judge Whitman sat with the carefully neutral expression of a man trying to balance personal gratitude with professional obligation. But it was the sight of Vanessa standing near the back wall that made Michael's stomach clench with dread. She dressed carefully for the occasion, her blonde hair styled and her makeup perfect, but her expression carried the cold fury of someone who felt she was watching an elaborate con game play out in front of the entire community.